So what I want to do with everyone for the next sort of like hour, maybe just under an hour, is to walk through some of the ideas and actually build a very simple web application using Node.js and one of its packages called Express. So I'll do a lot of talking and a lot of like demonstrating for the next hour. And what I would like everyone to do is to pay as much attention as possible and take notes about things that are happening. There's going to be a lot that's new, all right? And so for everyone, it's going to be new, but I want you to try and think about what's going on so that when you come to do it yourselves this afternoon, you'll be able to have a basis to start work. I'll upload the recording as well, so you can watch what I do and go through it yourselves. But the best way to do this is just to try and watch what I do, take notes about things, and then we can do and have a look at it together. So the purpose of this is to make sure that you have like a high-level understanding of what we're going to be doing, how to approach it, and then you'll play around with it yourselves this afternoon, and then everyone can pair on the battle project for the next 4 days. So this is the focus. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing first. So far we've encountered one main way of being able to have a web page be interactive. The way that we've been doing it is we take our web page and we use JavaScript specifically thinking about events to drive any behavior, any interactions. So thinking about things like click events, things like button clicks, to be able to hook into that event and then trigger behavior to update the page, show something different. This is the main way that so far in the past couple of weeks we've been able to add sort of dynamic interactions to our web page. We're going to add a different way to do this now. And we're going to add another part of our understanding of how web applications work. So far, the past couple of weeks, we've just been dealing with clients, all right? A browser is a type of client. It's quite a sophisticated client. And we've been running JavaScript in the browser and able to interact with the page as a result. We have access to the document when we use JavaScript in the browser, and we can update HTML, we can update text based on different events. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at using HTTP instead. HTTP is simply a protocol or way of organizing text so that it's in a conventional format and then sending it to an external place. And that external place is a server. A server is set up to be able to handle different kinds of requests. Think of a server as just another machine that's very specialized in dealing with the requests. So a server can be one computer, it could be a network of computers. But it's just simply another computer, all right? So we're going to use HTTP and we're going to send a request from a client to a server. So this is going to be on this hand side of server. So what we need to be able to do is operate in two places. We're going to have to make sure that we understand what the client is responsible on the left and what the server is responsible on the right. Most of the code that we're going to write is going to live on the right-hand side. As you might imagine, we can use Node.js here. You can't use JavaScript in the browser on the right-hand side. You can clearly use JavaScript on the left-hand side, the browser-based JavaScript, because that's in the browser. So on the right-hand side, we have to figure out a way to listen to requests and send back data. So this is the main purpose of an application that lives on a server, is to understand which requests are coming in and to send back the right information. So you might have a request, and you can think about this in terms of the URLs you've been using to make requests to APIs. So think maybe in comparison to the Guardian API that you did for the news summary challenge, there were perhaps different URLs or different endpoints, but still all on the same server, the Guardian servers. So the same first part of the URL, but then maybe was changing the different paths. So what we're going to be doing is figuring out how to write this server, or really specifically the application that we're going to put on the server, to be able to listen to different kinds of requests and send back the right kind of data. We've encountered some kinds of requests already. We've encountered a GET request and a POST request. These will be able to have a little bit more meaning by the end of tomorrow. What is the difference between these two things is something that we're going to make sure we have an understanding of tomorrow morning. What is the difference between these two kinds of requests? But in general, like you would imagine, and when you write an address on an envelope, you need a few critical things to make sure the request ends up at the right place. All right, so again, think of it as like writing an address on an envelope, same thing as making a request. You have to have the kind of request, the method type. Again, this is like, is it a GET request? Is it a POST request? What kind of a request is it? There's a few other kinds of HTTP requests we can make. What is the URL? And is there any additional, sorry for the loud noise, is there any additional request data that we send across? Usually we call this in the request body. These are the main critical requirements to be able to execute a request. All right, we have to know what kind of request is it. It's really these first two, and the third one is if we do need data, we need to make sure it's in the request. Where to go and what kind of request. Now, you can formulate the best kind of request, but it will ultimately not succeed if you don't have an application that's listening to those kinds of requests. So whatever request is being made, you have to handle them appropriately. So on the server side, you need to make sure there is what we call routes, saying my application on the server can accept these kinds of requests. And you essentially have a list of addresses that you allow. So your application might only say, I only handle GET requests at this certain URL. Anything else that you send it won't succeed. All right, so your server has to, on this side, specify which routes are available so that you can execute a successful request to it. Right, there are two parts to it. There's always like the sender and the receiver. You have to make sure your request is formulated correctly, but you also have to make sure the route is available on your server. So we're going to have a look at this in a second. But it's important we understand both parts of this. You have to make sure the address is written correctly and that the address is known and available. If it's not available, however you formulate the request won't succeed. So this is why we draw it in this diagram with an arrow from the client to the server, and the server then has to send back data to the client. So if the top is the request, then down here is the response. Now, so far, you've been dealing with responses in the format of JSON. This is not only the only kind of format that we can get responses back. We can get responses back in different formats. So we're going to make sure that we send our responses back in HTML. The reason for this is that browsers very neatly render HTML. They don't, as you've all found out, they don't render JSON. They just see you just see text on the page. But if the browser reads line by line the HTML, it will render it correctly. So when we do this kind of approach where the server is responsible for sending back HTML, we call this server-side rendering. All right, we build up exactly what the user is going to see over on the server, and we send that text over to the client. Whereas what you've been doing so far using React on the left-hand side and no interaction with the server to figure out what it looks like is, as you might imagine, called client-side rendering. Now, at some point, we might imagine applications doing both, but for the moment, we're keeping them separate. All right, we've just spent 2 weeks doing client-side rendering, and now we're moving on to server-side rendering. All right. So far we've seen responses back in JSON. You ask for request data from an API, you make that successful GET request because the server has been set up to handle that request method with that URL. You can make a successful request, you get back that JSON response. In this case, we're going to build our own application on the server, and it's going to give back HTML. So this data will always have its critical requirements are a status code, a set of information about the response called headers, usually key value pairs, and then any response data. Usually we call this the response body. With these three things, the browser can look at it and give you back whether the right error code. Was your application broken? Was it a 500? Did you make an error? Is it some kind of 400 level? Did it redirect? Was it a successful response? Those kinds of things. Headers is any information about the response. And the response data is the body. Now, most of us we don't have to worry about for the moment. We just want to make sure that we understand the data in it. And we'll dive into this tomorrow morning to have a look at some of these example requests and responses. But for the moment, just keep yourselves high level about kind of understanding the picture between a client and a server. How are they going to interact? And once we get that data back, that response data, then the browser is going to take it and then render it. And so we'll see something on the page here. Now, the way that we organize our application on the right-hand side here in this part here is according to, well, at the moment, the way that we're going to do it, there's a few different ways we can do it, but for this week and for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about how we organize it according to models, views, and controllers. We're going to organize our application in these three parts. We're not going to worry about the models just for the moment until we get to using databases. But the views and the controllers are something that we're going to work on. Let's talk about it very quickly. The responsibility views and I can't spell this very well. Oh my goodness. Controllers. Just about. A controller is responsible for the request and sending back the response. The view is responsible for what the page is going to look like. Now, some people get confused with thinking the views are actually on the client side, but everything is still on the server. This is simply where we place logic to describe what it's going to look like. In the same way that you might think about a component, you can also think about a certain view. But they're going to be files, and we're going to have a look at them when I go through it in a second. But this is how we're going to sort of separate the concerns. And so when we have a look at an application in a typical MVC pattern, when you go to any typical MVC application, you'll be able to see these three different areas, and they should be organized accordingly. So controllers are the thing that are responsible for listening to the request and sending back a response, and views is where we put logic to think about what is it going to look like, the specific pages. Okay. I think this is what I wanted to describe at the moment. We'll probably come back to this in a second, but let's have a look at building a simple application that does these things. And I'll try and do it slowly. What I'm going to do, let's have a quick example over here. What I'm going to do is let's have a page that when you navigate to it at the index is going to show you like a little welcome message, and then it's going to give you two input boxes and a little submit button where you can put in your first name, your last name, and a button to click. And once you click that button, you're going to see a page that says your whole name. All right, very simple, very straightforward. You put text in these boxes, you click a button, and as a result, what we're going to do is we're going to send data, and we call this by post. I'm going to post to a certain URL called, and let's call it like name. And after we make that request, we're going to see a page with the first name and last name together. All right. So this, we'll be able to see the first part, which is let's make a GET request to the index. Let's see the data on the page. Let's execute a POST request with some data, and we'll see the result on the page. All right, some of you might already be thinking about how you would execute this using React or just client-side rendering, thinking about on this submit button or on this click event, find the values in these input fields, take that data, manipulate it, and update the page. Also possible. All right, but we're just focusing on server-side rendering now. All right, how do we send that data to a server and then figure out what the view's going to look like, and then send the response back to the client. All right, so this is going to be the intended interaction. Does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up if you're still on track. If you're not asleep, if you're asleep, you won't give a thumbs up. Awesome. People on Bridget maybe asleep. It's fine. Okay. Let's have a look. So this is an empty directory, and let's have a look at how we'll do this. So the first step is always to initialize your project as a Node project. We're back to using Node.js. Everything on the server side is written in Node.js. Everything on the client side, if you're using JavaScript, is browser JavaScript. clearly we need a feature test for this, so we're not excusing ourselves from writing tests. We're still writing tests. npm install. It's not a production dependency, so save as a development dependency. Save dev Cypress, and let's also install Express. So Express is going to be the framework that we use, another JavaScript framework that allows us to write in a more abstract way, rather than sort of like super detailed and nitty gritty web applications. There's still a bunch of things we have to do, you'll see. So we can use Express and we can install it like this. And we'll just stay back for a second. So let's have a look at what we've got so far. So let's open up our Cypress. Let's initialize it. Come on, Cypress. Go through your thing. By now, this should be a very familiar process. Let's get rid of you by default. Let us write what's your let's write a quick feature test that describes what this is doing over here. That's what we're going to describe in a test. What's your name? So you can get out of the way. Stop being noisy. It can show you your full name. Let's not worry about the naming so much. Okay, so first step is let's visit the index. Then we'll have to input things into these text boxes and click this button. So I guess let's do a couple of, let's get first name by ID and then type into it me. Let's do me. And let's get the last name and type in my last name. Yay. Let's also get that submit button and click it. And then we can make an assertion that says something like, I don't know, grab the thing that will hold the full name and make sure it, why did you go there? Contains the whole name. All right. Anyone feel like they want to talk more about this test? Anything that's unusual? I don't know. Hopefully not. Yeah. So far so good. This is codifying this expected behavior when from perspective of the user. I could probably make an assertion as well that when I visit this, get welcome message should contain hi team, something like that. All right. So I have a Cypress test. Clearly, I haven't written anything else yet, so this is not even going to work. But let's just make sure it keeps driving our development from a perspective of TDD. So this is the spec. I should click it, please. Cool. All right. So nothing is found at the moment because I have to actually run the application. So let us open up a new window, keep Cypress running at the moment. I might, given that it's trying to open up on a random port, let's actually be specific here and say base URL is going to be, I think I know that it's going to be local HTTP load. I think it's 3000. Let's start there. What I'm expecting is to say that we haven't got it running. This will force us to actually make sure we have something running. Okay, so I've written my feature test. This will fail until I've written it, and now I actually have to have a look at how we set up an application using Express. So let's go to the docs for Express. Let's have a look at expressjs.com. We've gone through and already installed it. Let's have a look at REST API documentation. Getting started. Is it getting started? Installing. Yes, yes, yes. Entry point, index.js. So we need an index.js file. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, this is a simple application. So let's have a look at just copying this and having a look at what it does. So I'm going to throw it into here. Line 1, we import our dependency. This is the node module called Express that we require. Then we activate it. So on line 2, we invoke it and store it in a variable called app. We set our ports. And then this is how we're going to write essentially what I was talking about by making sure we describe what routes are available. And this is kickstarts our application. So on line 9 is actually telling it to run. So in order to run my application, in this very simple Express application, I'm going to go back to my terminal and run it as a file. All right, node index.js. It logs out here because this listen event happens when the application starts, and then this callback happens. So it tells me that I've got an application running at localhost 3000. Let's have a look at it. Localhost, not 8080, let's go to 3000. Yay, your first web application. All right. What's just happened here, let's try and go back to here, is rather than this request response cycle, let's quickly model another one. Is by navigating to the index, I made a GET request. It's meant to be a capital G, but it ended up being a lowercase g. Get to the index. This is the request that just happened. And my server over here, my application, my server has set up a route to say, when I receive any GET requests that have a URL that matches index, then send back a response called hello world. So over here is the response, and here we have hello world. So just thinking about making sure you're following in your heads about what just happened. Go back to here. If I refresh the page, I make that request, and I see back the results. All right. I can change what happens by saying hello, hi, team. And every time you do this, you're going to have to kill the application and restart it. Hi, team. All right. So again, request response cycle. I make the request, my server handles it, figures out, is it a GET method? Is it an index, a URL? And then if so, send back the correct response. If I said something like, hello, I am only going to listen to requests at this URL with a GET method, then I have to make sure I send the request in the right way. So let's kill the application and restart it. And if I now try and make the request at localhost 3000 at the index, it has no idea what to do, all right, my application, because I've made the request with a wrong address. It's like someone writing a letter but not putting the right address on. Your application only handles certain routes, all right? So the way that we can make sure we execute that request is by making sure we provide the right address. So if I call it /hello, say my application can only handle requests, a GET request at /hello, then you need to make sure it's the same. All right. So there are always two parts. Your client has to make sure you've got the right address, but your application also has to make sure it can handle that request. There's two parts to this. This might trick some of you out. That's not the right metaphor, but fine. Making sure that your client is making the right request and your application is handling it. Okay, so let's go back to this diagram. All right, I want to make a GET request to the index and see this on the page. So rather than keep writing a bunch of stuff in here, now I could also like add specifically to make HTML here. I could do something like, I don't know, H1 like this. Right, still just text, so send back text and the browser will still render it. So let's try and see what the difference is if I do this. So this is what it looked like first. If I try and run it again. That's hello. I now have an H1 heading. So you can send back text in the form of HTML and your browser will still render it. All right, so you could add a bunch of things into here. You could add like another paragraph if you want to have a really long HTML string, and your browser will still render it absolutely fine. So I just kill the application. I'm running it again. And we can just build up our HTML like this, yeah? So we can keep adding a bunch of different HTML elements, but notice it's all in a string and it's not going to look very readable. And it's not going to help you try and debug or try and find things. There's no syntax highlighting because it's all in Node.js. So one way we can get around this is by using sort of template engine to handle this logic for us. So what I want to do is put all of this stuff in a file somewhere and say, go find this file with the right stuff in it, and then send that back to the client. It'll still put it into a string in terms of HTML text, but it'll just be easier to read and easier to write in the first place. So what I want to do, rather than add all this text here, is have some kind of file, and we'll put it in a views folder, and I'll tell you why in a second. That says something like, let's call it the index, because that's the original page. I'll talk about why I've called it EJS in a second. And I want something like this, right? I'm just going to transfer whatever I've done here. So we get a little bit closer to just normal HTML that we can write and understand. So I'm not going to actually need to specify it here, but what I need to do is find a way to get to this file. So I'm going to provide it the name of the file, and I'm going to use render as this method. Again, these are specific issues. Don't worry so much about it. You can follow yourselves when you get to it. But the high-level concept here is we're going to store any logic, any view logic, in a file in a views folder that's responsible for showing that part of the application. All right, we're not going to just do a lot of inline strings with HTML here. Just keep things compartmentalized according to this pattern of views and controllers. So in order to make sure we're able to see this file, we have to add a line here to make sure that the application is able to convert this file into the right thing. All right, trying to build that back up into a string that you can send back to the client. So what we call this is using a view engine. Some people like to call it like a template engine. Something that, and there are lots of different formats that you can use. I think by default, Node.js comes with Jade as like the name of a template, a view engine. There's EJS, which we'll use. There's Haml, there's Pug, there's a few others that are different view engines that you can use. All right, the most simple one we're going to use is called embedded JavaScript, EJS, embedded JavaScript, and we're going to use that. So as a result, we have to make sure we configure the application. So all we're going to do is going to take this app variable, and we're going to use it. I can't remember, it's set, probably set. Let's double check. Maybe something here. No. Can you show me working with EJS? No, you're not really going to give me that much, are you? I think I have to do something like. Where am I going to find it? How to set name and value. I might just have to do this by memory rather than views. View engine. I think it's view engine. Set view engine, and then EJS, I think, is what we're going to do. But if I'm using EJS, I think I actually have to install it as a dependency. So let's install it. Actually, we'll also look at the docs for this, because clearly looking at Express docs, EJS docs is not helping us. Get started, that'll be great. Okay, install EJS. Yep. That's what I have to do. Okay, so if I install it, I can set it. Let's just see what happens when I run it, and we'll come back to this in a second rather than this slow me down. Okay, let's figure out. I think I've looked at this. There's the name, and this is the value. I've installed it. I don't think I need to do anything else. Let's have a look. So let's run it. Oh no, I don't want to do that. Let's go node index. Let's have a look at whether we have something available to us. What is my URL still at hello? I don't really want it to be at hello. Let's get back to the index. Kill it again, start it, and let's have a look. Cool. All right. So let's make sure that's still as expected, and let's make sure we can change it. Cool. So what I just did was try a quick extraction. Say I'm not going to keep everything in this file. This at the moment is representing our controller. It's listening to requests and sending back the right response. And I've said rather than keep everything inline here, I'm going to outsource everything to a file, specifically this file called index. And usually for every request, you match a different file or a different view. All right, so at a certain URL index, I'm going to render an appropriately named view called index.ejs. I've named it a .ejs because this is what's required by embedded JavaScript. It automatically looks in a views folder and finds the file called index.ejs. So I imagine, do I even need to use that? I don't know. Well, let's leave it for the moment. So I'm providing it with the file name. It finds this file name, looks at this text here, converts into something that we can send back as a string, and my browser then reads it. So I can keep this quite neat and tidy, and usually the convention here is to keep our controllers as slim as possible without as much logic. So we've now shoveled this back into a views folder for that to be responsible for it. All right. So now let's go back and add more information to this view. All right. If we go back to my feature spec, I should actually make sure it shows the right thing. Hi team. Hi team, and this should have an ID of welcome. So if I go back to my feature test, let's see how far we got. We should be able to get that first assertion, and then fail at not being able to find the element on the page. Times at 250. Right. Cool. So we would pass that first assertion. We can see hi team on the page, but we don't have the input field. So let's add those to my page. The main vehicle that we're going to use to make requests from our browser is using a form element. The form element takes a few important requirements. All right. So as I said, like we were doing in the browser, we have to make sure the address of the request matches the application saying what it can handle. We have to get these two attributes correct. All right, this is important. So again, back to my diagram here. If I am making a request from my client, I have to make sure the address is correct. All right, what method and what URL. My application also has to support it, has to handle that request. The moment we know that my application handles any get method to the index. So in my form here, I have to make sure the action represents the URL at the index, and my method represents the HTTP verb, all right, get. I'm going to have a couple input fields and one submit button. I don't need any starting values for my text fields. And I don't need a name for my submit button. The value here is going to be something like, let's go. So they need some IDs because my test has to find them: first name, last name, submit button. First name, last name, and submit button. So this is making sure that we can target appropriately in our Cypress test, and also if we need to, style them in any way. First name, last name, submit button. And we're going to talk about this in just a second, but let's have a look at what we see on the page. Cool, so this is currently what we see. All right, two input fields and a button that makes a request. Now, I want to send this data not to the original page. All right, currently, this is making a request to the index with the method get, but this is not where I want to send this data. If I go back to my diagram, this is the original page. When I make the request, I want to send data using a post request to /name. All right, and you want to set up another route for my application. So I'm going to say, I'm going to give it an action of /name, and I'm going to post this data. If I do this without updating anything on my application side, it will give me an error saying you can't post this URL. So let's have a look at this happening. So if I refresh this page and say something like where's my fingers? Edit, go. All right, because our application isn't set up with a route to handle this request. So let's make sure our application can. So I'm going to put this on the right-hand side. This is the address of the request, post to name. So in the same way that we've written this, let's write another one for not a get method, but a post, and this is a /name. All right, let's have a look at what console log is in the. Let's just say in the post method. In the get method. So you can see at what point each one of these fires. Let's go ahead and have a look. So I'm going to start back at the index. You can have a look here in your terminal logs, your server logs here. This is it running, and this is where all your console log statements will happen. And that were in the get method because we just fetched the index. Now, if I try and fire off this form, you can see that we trigger in the post request. All right, that means I've successfully handled, I haven't given back the browser anything, but I've successfully handled the request. All right, I've matched the post request with the URL name, and so this logic fires. Now I want to be able to take the data from these input fields and then show them. All right, so what I want to at some point do is render another view. Let's call it, I don't know, full name. Full name.ejs. And I want to send it some data. So we'll have a look at that. This is probably the last thing that we'll do before this should work. So I want to write a new file. If this file is responsible for showing what my form is going to look like over here, then I want a new view that shows me what the results are going to look like. All right, what is the names together? So let's write a new file called full name.ejs. All right, a different view. Usually a view corresponds with a page or part of the page. And here is, let's keep using headers because we like headings. And I want to somehow pass in data from this controller, this bit of logic here, into this file. And this is one of the reasons why it's called embedded JavaScript, because I can embed JavaScript in my view. So rather than just be entirely static like this, there's nothing that's being added to it using JavaScript. I can, by sending in some data as a second argument to the render here. So this is the first of the file name, and this is like any local variables we want. So the local variable I want, I imagine, will be something like first name that will come across. We don't know what it is yet, and last name. We don't know what it is yet. So I want to be able to send some data to add to this page, and what I want this to do is have the two names together. So the way that I embed JavaScript in an EJS file is by using something that looks like this. These are the opening and closing tags for embedded JavaScript. This is the opening on the left-hand side. This is the closing on the right-hand side, and you put some JavaScript in the middle here. So if I put in a variable, let's say it's called first name, I can access it like this. So this will look up before it does all the other HTML. It will turn this into HTML first. So this does a lookup for first name. Is there a variable in scope at the moment in time? If so, it gets that value and then embeds it into the HTML. So whatever I pass from this controller, this little function here, then gets added to my web page. So whatever data comes across, I can then add to my page. So if we want to do first name in JavaScript and last name, I guess we could interpolate the space, something like this. All right, we're working backwards a little bit because we haven't figured out how to get this data yet from the original request. But this is what I want my view to do. All right, this is what I want. If we go back to here, this is what I want this first and last name. So I'm going to send that request across. I'm going to post that data, and I want to access the data the form data that's been sent across. And then I'll take that data and show a new page. All right, this render function then goes to that file, gets that HTML, and then sends it back to the browser to show. So the last part that's missing is how to access the request body. All right, if we go back to here, I'm going to post data, but not just using the request method and the URL, but I also want to make sure that I send across first name and last name. All right, this is part of the request that's being sent across. Whatever's text is in these two fields. When I click this button, I make the request, and that data should be part of the request, which means my application needs to handle it. All right. Hold on, I'm going to close my window because it's being very loud for me. It's the weekly collection of rubbish. Okay. What was I doing? I think I was trying to work my way through this last section, talking about how to get data from a request. Okay. The way that we access it is by looking at this request argument here. So we haven't really talked about a lot of these things, and this is okay because we'll spend some time this afternoon just playing around with it, just recreating these steps, and then we'll go through looking in detail tomorrow morning about what the request and response are. But this first argument to this function is the request, and we have access to it, so we can look at different parts of it. And the property that we're interested in is the request body. So we can have a look at what this is at this point in time. So let's have a look at it when I reboot my application. And there's going to be one step that we need to add to make this work. So we'll have a look at this first, and then we'll add in the last step. So let us, this will clearly fail. So let's make sure this is commented out for the moment. We'll send back an empty object, which means that will break as well. So let's just give them empty strings for the moment. Okay, so let's go back to this page and let's see what happens. So I ran my application. I logged when we were in the get method. That was the first page that we saw. Then I added it in the data into the input fields. I hit go, and we get undefined back. All right, this is the console log statement that happens here on line 13. I'm trying to look at the body of the request. So let's have a look at just what the request is first, and maybe we'll go back to the body just so we have a look at it. And then my console log fires, and I send back hard-coded data. All right, so I could hard code this and say, just so we can see this work. So I can hard code data, but at the moment, nothing is being sent across in this request, even though I want to be, because I've got this form which should be doing some of the right things. But at the moment, we're missing something. Let's see what's happening. So all this stuff is huge. There's a bunch of information that we don't really need to worry about. But this is all the underneath the hood, what's happening to convert that request into a JavaScript that we can manipulate. So,
sorry, Ed. I don't think the
oh,
screen recording is working.
Yeah.
For the
I
past
paused my screen share. Thank you for. So let's back up a second. Thank you for saying that. I wonder how far we would have gotten. And what I was trying to do was show how we're trying to access data from the request. This is the last missing link for this demonstration. All right, how do we get data from the form request, the form submission that's happened? When we submit a form, forms one of the main vehicles of executing a get or a post method from the browser. We execute that request. We want to get that data, any of that form data that's in that submission, and extract it in our application so we can manipulate it and do things with it. All right, so we have two input fields that should contain a first name and a last name. We want to access those here in this post request. So we try to find where are they, how do we access them? So we log the request here, and we see here in the server logs all this big object with a bunch of properties and functions that we don't need to worry about. But this contains all the information under the hood about how Node.js has converted that request into JavaScript and can help it do its work. All right. So you don't need to worry about it. There may be some debugging you can do to look through it and things like that. But the main thing we're going to try and access is the request body at the moment. But the request body is undefined. There's no body been set. And so the thing that we have to do is to allow our application to handle request bodies. So usually it's something like like this. I'm just going to do it for now. I think it's we have to pass it a default. Don't worry about this line for the moment, but I'll talk about it tomorrow. So I'm trying to make sure that we can access our request body. Our application doesn't handle form data by default, so we have to allow it to encode or unencode the form data that's been sent across. And I should be able to, oh, needs one more. So let's go back and repeat this to get it to fire again. Let's go back to the server logs, and we can see here that we actually now have not undefined, but an object. So we're one part closer, which is what I'm expecting. Our application can now handle request body data, but we're not sending anything across in the request. So then the last place we have to go find is, well, how are we sending the data across? And the way that we send data across is by making sure these input fields have the right name attributes. So the name attributes refer to the keys that we can access them over here on the right-hand side. So if I say I want to access from the request body something on or with the property of first name, for example, then on the left-hand side here, I need to make sure the name has the same name. All right, so whatever this is, if we extract it, has to already be in this format on the left-hand side. These things have to match. So if I want to add a bit of data from my form submission, because form submissions always come across in key value pairs, this is the key and the value will be whatever's the value. that people have typed into it. So correspondingly, I might want something called like last name for this input field. So these are the keys that I can use to extract the data. So in this case, if I console log first name and last name, I should now have access to them. Let's also have a look at the whole thing together. One more time. So I've now successfully sent across some data from my client, from my browser, using a post request. The post request has been executed by the form that I've written. I've submitted my form, which has created the HTTP request with a method of post and the URL of /name. And in the request body, I have these two properties, first name and last name, with the corresponding values. As a result, my application can read it. And if I wanted to then use those in my view, what I have to do is pass them to my render function. So I can get rid of this now. And let's finish this. So Edward, go, and we see it. All right. So let's try someone else's name. Ben, you're looking very, very happy there. Okay, let's just actually make sure my spec is passing, and then we'll stop. I might have forgotten to add full name. Probably needs an ID of full name. Full name. Boom. All right, passing each test as expected. So let's collapse a few of these and focus on what we've just done, and then wrap up for now. So we started off looking at how to write a simple application, and there are a few important parts to this, right? There's a lot that's new that we've covered. I'm not expecting anyone to sort of understand intimately the things we've done, but at a high level, the most important part about this is the interplay, the relationship between a client and a server. All right, visualizing this data flow from making a request and then the application handling it. All right, this side's probably a little better to have a look at. All right, we have to, if we want to interact or have interactions with web applications that only use server-side rendering, we have to send data to the server, and then it has to handle it and send back what we see. All right, there's no other way if we're just using server-side rendering, which is the point of this week, only server-side rendering. We have to make sure we write our what we call roots. Roots always have a certain HTTP verb and a URL. This is a relative URL, so it's just the path. And then we use a views file to encapsulate the logic of our view. All right, whatever we want to show to a user, we keep in specific files in a views folder. And we can fetch the right file by using the render method. We're using a view engine called EJS to help keep things simple. Allows us to write HTML, but we have to give it a file extension called EJS for it to work properly. All right, so whenever we write views files, we'll be using EJS. This allows us the ability to embed JavaScript within our HTML, so we can dynamically have different data. all right, as we've just done here. We can send in any first name or last name, and our controller will add it or dynamically to the this HTML before it sends it back to the client. We've written a get and a post method. We're going to send data using a form. Forms again are the main way we're going to be sending any kind of request. Any request you want, you'll need a form. Looking at specifically the action is where the URL, where you're going to send it to, and the method is the post or the get. Any data that you want to send across in the request, you have to make sure you give it appropriate name, attribute values. All right, this is going to be how you extract the data. All right, so whatever you put as your name for an input field, you can then access by that same name when you access it from the request body. That's how we can send data in a request and then extract it on a server side. In order to be able to extract a request body data, we have to make sure that we can manipulate or pass the URL encoded format for the request. So we have to add this line here. And that, in a nutshell, is a simple demonstration of a web application that you'll get to this week. All right, this should be the high-level understanding of what we're going to do. And even though a lot of it is new, you'll be filling in the blanks and you'll be remembering what the session has done as you do it yourselves this afternoon and the rest of this week. All right. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we can have a Q&A session. And then I will upload this video to YouTube and send it, share it with everyone so you can have a look again yourselves and walk through it. Because this afternoon, I want you to focus on recreating this. All right, walk through it again, recreate it. Entirely up to you whether you want to start from, as I did, just as like a domain model that looks like this, of used modeling and interaction and trying to see how far you get. Entirely up to you. I will also share this code as well, so you'll have access both the repository and the recording, and you can see how far you get. All right. Okay, let's stop this recording.